Welcome inside the Nebraska Soybean Board studio for a look at the latest in agriculture news today. It's Monday, which means it's time we check in with Jeff Peterson of Heartland Farm Partners, and he first talks about some of the driving factors in the corn and soybean markets at this time.
You know, what's interesting this time of year is that we're kind of looking at big picture, the time and difference between supply and demand. And what I mean by that is everybody's trying to understand where our supply is at. And, you know, we're just not getting enough yield reports yet. But it's going to start this week. We're going to see more yield reports coming in, and we'll get a handle on that. And then we're also trying to understand from the demand side. It's really hard to know because with the situation at the Gulf and not all the export elevators up and running yet, we don't know, okay, so how much is a reduction in our demand that we're seeing because of that, and how much of that is real world changes. So we've got that going on. The other thing we have to realize is that the funds are still long. They're long over 200,000 contracts of corn. They're long over 50,000 contracts of soybeans. So they're still wanting this market to go higher yet. And so we've got that going on. But then in addition, we're getting some outside pressure here this morning. As a matter of fact, I kind of thought we'd have been a little higher this morning, but we've got some news coming out of China that sounds like their largest real estate developer looks like they defaulted on a payment. So that's put some pressure on the stock market, which in turn caused the U.S. dollar to go higher. And when we have the U.S. dollar go higher, we generally see a little bit of pressure on crude oil, and we've seen that spill over in the commodities. So that's kind of where we're sitting this morning.
And Jeff also talked about harvest progress across the nation.
Yeah, so for harvest-wise, things are moving along. We'll know more this afternoon. Crop progress information will be out at 3 o'clock on Monday. What it looks like is that we'll probably be close to about 10% harvested on corn. And then on the soybean side, not quite as far along, probably 7 or 8% is kind of what our thoughts are. Overall conditions out of the report, I think we'll continue to see conditions go a little lower yet. And it's not, this time of year, it's probably not as important because the crop's in its final stages, but I think we will see the good to excellent ratings on corn and soybeans both go down probably 1%.
And Jeff also gave his thoughts on some early yield expectations.
Yeah, going forward, I think based on what the yield reports that we're hearing, Eastern Corn Belt, honestly, they had some big yields. NASS, the National Ag Statistics Service, in the last WASDE report had many records in the Eastern Corn Belt. What we're hearing is that they're getting into that crop. We're actually hearing that that crop is probably a little bit smaller than maybe what was anticipated. Now, we got to be careful about that because we know the first stuff harvested is usually some of the lowest yields. But I do think we're going to see a little bit lower yields coming out of the Eastern Corn Belt. Overall, though, we are looking for, I think, a little bit lower corn yield yet in future WASDE reports. But I do think because of the rains, I think we will see a little bit higher soybean yield.
Jeff also said that South America is something that we continue to keep our eye on, and here are his thoughts.
They've got that time of the, in between during the summer months, really up through mid-September, where they aren't able to have any soybeans physically planted or growing in Brazil. And actually last week, northern Brazil and southern Brazil can now plant soybeans. However, the conditions are dry, and that's not unusual for this time of year. The monsoon just hasn't kicked in yet. It'll be a lot more concerning if we get to this time of year in October. We get forward and we're probably still dry in October, but right now we're okay yet. But, planting on the soybeans is going very slow. Corn-wise, though, the first corn crop is moving along. They're probably about mid 20% planted on that. So we're watching that. A few other things that we've got our eye on, though, out of South America is what it looks like is they're talking about soybean acres for this 21 crop could be up about 3.7%, which that would give them actually increased production of about 6.7%. What they're talking about, though, is on the corn side, between the safrinha crop and also that first crop, it could be up about 6.3% on acres, but production could be up about 26%. And that's mainly because they had just such a poor safrinha corn crop because of dry conditions and also the multiple freezes that they had this past year.
And moving forward, Jeff shares what the corn and soybean markets will be watching.
Yeah, I think going forward, it's going to be what type of yield information are they going to end up seeing, and can we get those export elevators back up and running? And then at the end of the month, we can't forget about that, we'll also have the quarterly stocks report. So they'll use that as a way to see, is our demand information and where our ending stocks are for this 2020 crop, is that about where everybody expects it to be?
And finally, Jeff shared some of his thoughts on the near-term impacts of Hurricane Ida.
It's definitely going to impact the Eastern Corn Belt. And the Eastern Corn Belt, it's going to impact them in a couple ways. They aren't going to have the export capacity to get the ships loaded, as many as they would like to see. It's also going to impact the barge traffic on the Mississippi River. It's actually been beneficial for us so far in the Western Corn Belt, because what that's meant is there's been basically more ships that need to be loaded out of the Pacific Northwest, out of the Washington area, and that means those bushels are generally on both the corn and the soybean side kind of sourced from our part of the country. The only thing we have to keep an eye on, though, is the fact that they are getting close to capacity at the PNW, which means at some point in here we'll have to watch and make sure the basis doesn't soften a little bit. But the biggest impact I think we would end up seeing would be on the basis levels.
That again is Jeff Peterson of Heartland Farm Partners for today's Agriculture News. I'm Alex Wojcicki for the Rural Radio Network.